49 years, and I have never told the version that includes the corridor. I told the stage version. I told what happened on the couch. I told what Johnny said. What I never told was what happened outside dressing room 3 at 7:45 in the evening before any of it went on air, when two men had a conversation that nobody at NBC knew was happening, and that set the temperature for everything that followed. My name is David Cho. I am 78 years old. In 1974, I was a production intern on The Tonight Show, 23 years old, doing whatever the people with actual jobs needed done. My job that night was to make sure the corridor between the dressing rooms and the stage entrance stayed clear. I failed at that job in one specific moment, and that failure put me 11 feet from a conversation I was not supposed to hear. This is the whole story, the corridor version, the one I have been keeping for 49 years.
It started in Fred de Cordova's office 3 weeks before the taping. Fred had a problem. The problem was November sweeps and a show that had been running 12 years and that needed, periodically, to remind the country that it was still the place where the most interesting things on television happened. He had guests. He had segments. What he did not have was the specific combination that produced the kind of evening that people called each other about the next morning. He had two names on his desk: Burt Reynolds, Bruce Lee. Burt was 38 years old in 1974, and at the specific peak of what peaks look like when they are at their maximum, the place where everything you have spent years building has just arrived at its full scale simultaneously. Deliverance 2 years earlier had done something to his reputation that could not have been planned. Smokey and the Bandit was still 3 years away, but the trajectory was visible to everyone in the industry. He was the leading man that the industry had been looking for, the specific combination of physical ease and genuine comedic timing, and the particular quality of danger underneath the charm that made audiences trust him, while also being slightly nervous around him. He was also known for something that mattered for Fred's purposes, which was that Burt Reynolds had opinions. Not performed opinions, opinions he had worked out over years of navigating an industry that he understood very well, and that he was not shy about describing accurately. Bruce Lee was 33 years old and 9 months away from the release of Enter the Dragon, which would change everything. In December of 1973, he was on the specific edge between the version of himself that the industry had been managing and the version of himself that the industry would eventually have to acknowledge, but the acknowledgement had not happened yet. He was teaching martial arts in Los Angeles to people who would become famous, while his own name was still something that the people being famous were explaining to their agents. He had agreed to do The Tonight Show in the specific spirit of a man who understood that every public appearance was a brick in a wall he was still building. Fred understood what he had. Two men who occupied adjacent territory in the American entertainment landscape, who were very different things, and who had very different ideas about what they were, and who had never been in the same room. He booked them both. He told them both what they were expecting. Burt was the confirmed first guest, his name in the program, the standard setup. Bruce would come as a surprise second guest, no advance announcement, no promotion, which was his condition, and had been his condition since the beginning. What Fred did not do was tell Burt that there was going to be a second guest, specifically Bruce Lee, specifically the person who had been described in a production meeting that week as the most physically extraordinary specimen that had appeared on the show in its 12 years of running. Fred knew what those words would do to Burt Reynolds. He left them out of the booking conversation. They reached Burt anyway. This is how information moves in a building with 200 people in it, the same way water moves. Finding every available channel, arriving at places it was never directed to go. I was in the equipment area at the north side of the building at 5:15 when Burt arrived, and I heard what Burt said when his publicist, a woman named Carolyn Marsh, told him about the second guest. Not Carolyn, not from the network, from a contact at a competing agency who had heard something from a production assistant who had heard it from a segment producer. What Burt said when he heard the name was not loud and not hostile. It was specific. He said, "They're putting a kung fu instructor next to me." Carolyn said something I didn't catch. Burt said something else I caught clearly. He said, "I want to know what Johnny thinks we have in common." That was the question, not a challenge, not a threat. A real question from a man who had spent 15 years fighting for the specific ground he now occupied and who was curious about what the network thought it was doing by placing someone from an adjacent territory in the same segment. He went to his dressing room. Bruce arrived at 6. Side entrance, alone, canvas bag, moving through the NBC Burbank corridor, with the quality that I had learned in 8 months of working this show, was not performed, and was not diminished by being in a building full of other people. He moved through spaces the way the spaces had been arranged specifically for him to move through them, which they hadn't been, which was the point. He was shown to dressing room 2, I walked him there. He thanked me by name, which he had learned in under a minute at the parking entrance. I noticed this. I have thought about it since. The specific attention he gave to learning and using the name of the production intern who walked him to his dressing room. Not politeness, practice. The same practice that made him the thing he was. Everything registered, everything used, nothing wasted. At 7:30, Fred came to do the pre-show briefing with both guests separately. I was in the corridor outside dressing room 2 when he went in. The door was not fully closed. Fred told Bruce the format. First guest, 8 to 10 minutes with Johnny solo. Then the second guest would be introduced. Bruce said, "Who is the second guest?" Fred said, "Burt Reynolds." A pause. Bruce said, "And what does he know about tonight?" Fred said, "The format. That you'll be the first guest, he'll be the second." Bruce said, "And what does he think about being the second?" Fred said, with the specific precision of someone choosing words carefully, "He's aware that the booking reflects the show's interest in exploring two different expressions of physical performance and action." Bruce said, "That's not what I asked." Fred said, "He may have some feelings about the specific comparison." Bruce said, "What feelings?" Fred told him, "Not all of it, but enough." The question about what they had in common. The specific quality of Burt's response when he heard the name. Bruce was quiet for a moment. He said, "Burt Reynolds has spent 15 years building a specific kind of career. He's done it in a context that was not built for me and has never pretended to be built for me. His feelings about being compared to a martial arts instructor from Hong Kong are probably legitimate." Fred said, "I want to make sure tonight goes well." Bruce said, "Tonight will go however it goes. What matters is that it's real." Fred left. I stayed in the corridor. At 7:45, the thing happened that I have never included in any version of this story I have told. Burt Reynolds left dressing room 3. He was not going to the bathroom. He was not going to the production area. He was walking with the direction of a man who has decided to address something rather than wait for the show to address it for him. He walked down the corridor toward dressing room 2. I was 11 feet away, in the alcove near the equipment cabinet where I was supposed to be, and there was no way to get out of the alcove without walking past him, which I could not do without him seeing me, so I stayed. He knocked on Bruce's door. Bruce opened it. They looked at each other for a moment. Burt said, "I'm Burt Reynolds." Bruce said, "I know who you are." Burt said, "Good. I wanted to come talk to you before this thing starts, because I think we should know where we stand before we sit down next to each other on live television." Bruce said, "Come in." I could hear them through the door, which was not fully closed. I was 11 feet away in an alcove. "I am going to tell you what I heard." Burt said, "I want to ask you something directly." Bruce said, "Go ahead." Burt said, "What does Fred think we have in common?" Bruce said, "I think Fred thinks we represent two different versions of what physical performance can be in film and television." Burt said, "I've been hearing for the last 2 hours that you've been described as the most physically extraordinary person who has ever appeared on this show. In 12 years. Bruce said, "I didn't say that." Burt said, "Fred's people said it." Bruce said, "Then Fred's people said something that was meant to create the right atmosphere for tonight's segment." Burt said, "And do you think it's true?" A pause. Bruce said, "I think it's a comparison that serves the booking." Burt said, "You didn't answer the question." Another pause. Longer. Bruce said, "I think I can do things with my body that most people cannot do with theirs. I think you can do things with yours that most people cannot do with theirs. I don't think those things are the same. I don't know what Fred thinks the comparison means." Burt said, "I'll tell you what it means to me. I have spent 15 years in this industry trying to be taken seriously as more than my face. Trying to get people to understand that what I do is not just looking good on a screen. It's work. Real, serious work. And when I get to a certain point in that work, the network puts a kung fu instructor in the same segment and implies we're doing comparable things." Bruce said, "I understand that." Burt said, "Do you?" Bruce said, "I've been trying to get this industry to take me seriously for the same 15 years you have. From a different direction and with a different problem, but the same basic experience of watching the door get held open just wide enough to see what's inside, and then closed before you can get through." Burt was quiet. Bruce said, "What you have built is real, and the industry has not fully acknowledged it yet. What I have built is real, and the industry has not acknowledged it at all. Fred putting us in the same segment may be his version of helping both of us, or it may be his version of entertainment. I don't know which." Burt said, "And that doesn't bother you?" Bruce said, "Being used for entertainment by people who don't fully understand what they're using has been my experience since I got here. I've learned to use it back. Burt was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I'm not going to pretend I don't have a problem with this. With being the second guest, with the comparison, I'm going to be honest about it on that stage. Bruce said, I'd expect nothing less from you. Burt said, and if I say something that you think is wrong, you're going to say so. Bruce said, yes. Burt said, then we understand each other. He left dressing room 2. He walked back toward dressing room 3. He passed 11 feet from the alcove where I was standing, with my clipboard pressed against my chest, and did not look in my direction. I stood in that alcove for about 30 seconds after he was gone. Then I went to find Fred. Fred was near the monitors in the production area. I told him what I had heard. Not all of it, the broad shape of it, that Burt had gone to Bruce's dressing room, and they had talked, and the conversation had ended with an agreement that they would both be honest on stage. Fred looked at me. He said, Henry told you to stay in the corridor and not let anyone through. I said, I was in the corridor, I didn't let anyone through. He said, Burt got through. I said, Burt Reynolds walked through. I was not going to physically prevent Burt Reynolds from walking through a corridor. Fred said, what do you think is going to happen tonight? I said, I think it's going to be interesting. He said, interesting is not the word I need tonight. He went back to his monitors. Showtime. The monologue went well, the room warm from the first minute. Johnny was good that night, in the way he was good when he had decided that he was going to enjoy himself regardless of what the evening produced, the specific ease of a man who trusts his own ability to handle whatever comes. He introduced Bruce first. The response from the audience was the wave. The recognition traveling through 400 people at different speeds, as the name connected to the face, and the face connected to what people knew, and what they knew caught up with what they were seeing. Bruce walked out and moved across the stage and shook Johnny's hand and sat down, and the response completed itself into genuine, sustained applause. Johnny said, the last time you were on this show, I asked you to demonstrate something on my hand, and I haven't forgotten it since. Bruce said, it was a basic redirection. Your grip produced a force. I gave the force a different direction. Johnny said, toward my doctor's office, apparently. The audience laughed. They talked for 9 minutes, water, formlessness, the relationship between training and instinct. Bruce was what he was in these conversations, specific and clear and generous with the clarity, and Johnny asked real questions because Bruce's answers made real questions the only ones worth asking. Then Johnny looked at camera 2. He said, my next guest is someone who I don't think needs me to say very much about, because frankly, the man speaks for himself better than I could speak for him. Ladies and gentlemen, Burt Reynolds. The curtain opened and Burt walked out. The response was different from Bruce's. Not louder, not warmer. Differently warm. The warm of 400 people who have been watching someone become famous over 15 years and who feel, when they see him in person, that their loyalty has been honored. He shook Johnny's hand. He turned toward the couch. He looked at Bruce. Something passed across Burt's face, in that look that I was close enough to the stage to see. Not the complex measuring look I had watched through the alcove wall 45 minutes earlier. Something more settled. The look of a man who has had the conversation he needed to have and has arrived at the couch knowing where he stands. He sat down. Johnny said, 2 of the most interesting people I have ever had on this show, on the same couch. I feel like I should just sit back and see what happens. Burt said, that might be the safest choice. The audience laughed. Burt's timing was what it always was, effortless, in the way that only years of actually working at something produces. Johnny asked Burt about what he was building, about where things were heading, about what the last few years had produced in terms of understanding what he was and what the industry was going to do with it. Burt talked about it honestly, about what Deliverance had cost and what it had given, about what it meant to be taken seriously in a way the industry had not taken him seriously before, and what that seriousness required to maintain. He was specific and real, and the audience was with him the way audiences get with performers they have watched long enough to trust. And then Johnny asked the question. He said, Burt, you and Bruce represent 2 very different approaches to physical performance in film and television. Bruce has spoken about the relationship between training and instinct, about 20 years of daily work and what that produces. You've talked about the work of becoming a leading man, the specific crafts involved in that. Do you see yourselves as doing related things? Burt was quiet for a moment. If you think that pause was just Burt thinking about his answer, what he said next will show you that the pause was something more specific. He said, Johnny, I want to say something honest about this booking. Johnny said, please. Burt said, I was told before I came out here tonight that Bruce Lee is the most physically extraordinary person to have appeared on this show in its 12 years. And I want to say honestly that my first response to hearing that was not generous. The audience murmured. Johnny leaned forward slightly, the specific lean of a host who has felt the temperature change and is deciding whether to manage it or follow it. Burt said, "My first response was to wonder what the network was trying to say by putting that description next to my name, what the implication was. Whether the segment was designed to place me in a comparison that I hadn't agreed to." Johnny said, "And now?" Burt said, "And now I've sat down on this couch and I'm going to tell the truth." He looked at Bruce. He said, "I've spent 15 years in this industry trying to get the industry to understand what I am. And the industry has understood it partially, and at its own pace, and often for the wrong reasons. That's a frustrating experience. And my instinct when I heard about tonight was to be defensive about it." Bruce said nothing. He was giving Burt the full attention he gave to things that required it. Burt said, "The thing about being defensive is that it's almost always a response to something true that you don't want to be true." The audience was very quiet. He said, "What I was being defensive about is this. Bruce Lee has built something that I can see from where I sit is real. Whatever he does when cameras aren't on him, whatever he's built in the years before the films, is real in a way that I can recognize because I know what real looks like in a discipline. I know what it looks like in mine. And the instinct to be defensive about someone else's real is the instinct of someone who isn't sure enough of their own." Johnny said quietly, "Burt." Burt said, "I'm not done." Johnny closed his mouth. Burt said, "What I want to say to Bruce directly is that the reason tonight bothered me, before it started, has nothing to do with him, and everything to do with me. With the 15 years of trying to get this industry to see past the surface. With the specific frustration of watching a place decide what you are before it knows what you are. I heard his name, and I heard the description, and I assumed the booking was designed to diminish something. Because that's been my experience of how this industry works." He looked at Bruce. He said, "I don't think that's what tonight is." Bruce said, "No." Burt said, "What is it?" Bruce said, "Two men who have been told separately what they are, and who have not agreed with the telling, in the same room, for the first time." The studio was very quiet. Not the uncomfortable quiet of a room waiting for something to break. The specific quality of quiet that settles when something true has been said simply, and the room is absorbing it. Burt said, "I almost didn't come out here." Johnny said, "I'm aware of that." Burt said, "You knew?" Johnny said, "Fred told me there was some tension around the booking. He did not tell me there would be this much honesty on my couch at 11 p.m. The audience laughed. The release of people who have been in something and have been given permission to breathe. Burt said, "Here's the thing I want the people watching to understand. When you spend enough time fighting for what you are, you start to see threats that aren't there. You start to read every booking, every comparison, every adjacency as something designed to reduce you. And sometimes it is. And sometimes it's just two people on a couch who have more in common than the surface suggests." He looked at Bruce. He said, "We've both been told what we are, by people who hadn't finished watching yet." Bruce said, "Yes." Burt said, "And we've both kept going anyway." Bruce said, "Yes." Burt said, "That's something." Bruce said, "It's the main thing. If you think that exchange was the peak of the evening, the moment that the show would be remembered for, what happened in the last 2 minutes of the segment will show you that you were still in the middle of the story." Johnny let the moment breathe. He was good at knowing when to let things breathe and when to redirect, and what he chose here was to breathe. He sat behind his desk, and he gave the two of them the space to be in the moment they were in, and he protected that space the way the best hosts protect things, by doing nothing visible. Then he said, "There's something I want to ask both of you, and I want honest answers, not television answers." They both looked at him. He said, "When you go home tonight, after this, what are you going to take from this conversation?" Burt went first. He said, "I'm going to take the fact that I was wrong about what tonight was going to be. I came here defensive. I left the defensiveness at the couch. That's going to be the last time I let a booking tell me what something is, before I find out for myself." He said it simply. The honesty of a man who doesn't dress things up. Bruce was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm going to take the fact that the person I expected to be the most uncomfortable thing about tonight was actually the most interesting part of it." Burt said, "Are you saying I'm interesting?" Bruce said, "I'm saying your honesty is." Burt said, "I'll take that." The audience applauded. The warm, specific applause that 400 people give something when they have been surprised by its quality and are expressing surprise as much as approval. Johnny looked into camera 1. His expression was the specific expression he had when something had happened on his stage that he hadn't planned and that had exceeded what he had planned. A particular fullness in the eyes, the look of someone who is grateful for his job in a way that he can't perform because the feeling is real. He said, "I've been doing this for 12 years. In 12 years, the best moments have always been the ones I didn't see coming. What you just watched is the reason I'm still here." He went to credits. The studio stayed warm after the taping ended. The audience filed out slowly, the way they file out when they're not ready to leave what they were inside. I watched from my position near the corridor entrance. Burt was the first off the stage. He went toward the corridor and I saw Bruce come off a few steps behind him and I saw Burt stop and wait, which was not something Burt Reynolds had to do for anyone, and they walked toward the dressing rooms together, not talking, just walking with the ease of two people who have been somewhere together and don't need to fill the silence with anything. At the turn in the corridor, Burt stopped. He said something to Bruce. I was too far to hear it. Bruce said something back. Burt nodded. The small nod of a man receiving something he is going to keep. He went to dressing room 3. Bruce came toward the stage exit. He passed me. He stopped. He said, "David." He said my name. The name he had learned at the parking entrance 6 hours earlier. He said, "You stayed in the corridor tonight." I said, "Yes." He said, "You heard the conversation." I said, "Most of it." He said, "What did you think?" I said, "I thought it was the most honest thing I had heard in 8 months of working on this show." He looked at me for a moment. He said, "Hold on to that. The honest things are the ones worth keeping." He went through the exit. I stood in the corridor for a while. Fred came past at some point doing his post-show rounds. He stopped when he saw me. He said, "How did tonight go?" I said, "I think tonight was the thing you were looking for." He said, "The tension." I said, "The resolution of it." He said, "Is there a difference?" I said, "There is, if you're watching closely enough." He looked at me for a moment. Then he went back to his rounds. I drove home at midnight. I sat in my apartment and I thought about the conversation I had heard through the door of dressing room 2. About Burt saying, "I think we should know where we stand before we sit down next to each other on live television." About Bruce letting him in without hesitation. About the conversation that should not have happened and that made every conversation that happened after it possible. Bruce Lee died 8 months after that Thursday. He was 32 years old. I heard the news in the morning and I sat with it for a while. I thought about the corridor. About the specific quality of Burt's voice when he said his first response was not generous. About Bruce saying the same 15 years from a different direction. About what it meant to be held almost outside a door that the people on the other side of it kept telling you was almost open. Burt Reynolds died in 2018. He had done everything the trajectory of 1974 suggested he was going to do. The career that had been building was the career that arrived, and it arrived at a scale that the industry had not fully predicted, even when the signs were visible to everyone. I thought about dressing room 2, and the knock on the door, and the question about what they had in common. They had the same 15 years. Different doors, different angles, different distances from the thing they were trying to reach. Same 15 years. Same quality of not having been told yes often enough by people who had the power to say yes, and who had their own ideas about what yes was for. That was what they had in common. Fred booked them because he wanted interesting television. He got something more specific than that. He got 2 men who had each been managing the same fundamental frustration in completely different ways, in the same room, and who found the shared ground underneath the different expressions of it when they stopped performing their respective versions of having it together long enough to tell each other the truth. I was 23 years old and in an alcove with a clipboard, and I heard all of it. I am 78 years old now. That's the whole story. All of it, including the corridor. That's what I've been keeping.